The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is a really tough act to follow. When the Switch game came out in 2017, it was a total surprise, and that's what made it special. Nobody knew what to expect at the time. It left room for people to be wowed by its radical reinvention of the open world formula and of the Zelda series at large. So any sequel was going to have a really hard time reaching those heights. Now, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is out, and it's trying to do exactly that. But does it pull it off? I think it does, and let me tell you why. Hi, I'm Giovanni Colantonio. I'm the gaming section lead here at digitaltrends.com, and I'm here with our review of The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Now, this is a direct sequel to Breath of the Wild that picks up not too long after that game ends. In it, Link and Zelda find the dehydrated corpse of Ganondorf, the Demon King, hidden below Hyrule's surface. Unfortunately, he comes back to life, the Master Sword is destroyed, and Link and Zelda are separated. It's up to Link to stop Ganondorf and find Zelda while learning some of the history of ancient Hyrule. Now, there's one thing in particular that I think is really special about this game, but before I get to that, let's talk about some of the basics. Tears of the Kingdom is very much a direct sequel to Breath of the Wild, and what I mean by that is that anything that you liked in that game is probably here, and everything you didn't like is probably here too. It's still the same gameplay loop where you are doing really freeform exploration, using stamina that allows you to climb any surface. Now, you'll go to towers, you'll do puzzle-like shrines, you'll find Koroks. Just about all of those hooks remain here, but there are a few small differences that I want to highlight for a good reason. For one, the main story beats revolve around temples, which are a little bit closer to classic Zelda dungeons, though they're not exactly a return to form. Even so, I think they'll feel a little more familiar than the divine beasts in Breath of the Wild, which makes them feel a little more classic. In addition to that, classic Zelda boss fights are back, which is a really nice change of pace. Rather than getting these straight hack-and-slash action battles against blighted Ganon, you get these more gimmick-centric fights where you have to find out the strategy just like you would in classic Zelda games. Now, on top of that, there's also this companion system where when you beat main story quests, you get characters with special abilities. This was kind of in Breath of the Wild, but it's even more central here. For example, you'll get a Goron that can roll into rocks to break them, which means that you don't have to use a hammer anymore. He's almost a mobile bomb. It reminds me a little bit of old Zelda games where you would unlock a hookshot or bombs in a specific dungeon, and then that gear would stay with you going forward. Those three ideas make this feel a little more in line with classic Zelda games, but as I said, it's not a total return to form. This is still very much Breath of the Wild. Rather, you can see the roots of the series in those ideas, and that is what I want to highlight here, because this game is all about archaeology. Okay, let me break that down. So, in Breath of the Wild, you were a stranger in a strange land. You were waking up with no knowledge of Hyrule or how the game played itself. You were very much an explorer who was charting Hyrule for the first time. But in this game, Link already knows Hyrule, and you as a player, if you've played Breath of the Wild, know it too. This game uses the same Hyrule map from the first game. And while that may sound like a little bit of a cop-out, it's not because of the way that new areas have been introduced alongside that. So for instance, the newest feature of this game is that there are sky islands. Above Hyrule, you'll find little islands that have different challenges on them. It kind of is similar to The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, where you had islands across an ocean, where every single one had a little treasure to find on it or something to do. That's true here too, and it's really rewarding. It's great to be able to go up to a sky island and know that you're going to find something up there. But while you're up there, you're also doing a little bit of research, because those islands are the ruins of the Zonai, the first people of Hyrule. A big part of the story is Link learning the early history of Hyrule, something he didn't know in Breath of the Wild. He's basically an archaeologist who is finding remnants of an old culture, their weird electronic devices and their robot constructs that are patrolling these islands still. He plays the role of a researcher, and that's kind of what the gameplay flow of this is versus that of an explorer. Now, there's another part of the game that you might not know about yet that reinforces that, which is the underground section of Hyrule. Yes, Nintendo has kept this a pretty good secret, but there is an entire world underneath Hyrule this time. And I mean an entire world. It is pretty much the entire map of Hyrule in its own kind of dark world, like A Link to the Past. Now, similarly, that is filled with ancient resources too. It has different ruins, it has ancient resources that are used to power the ancient Zonai devices and things like that. When you visit both of those areas, you're learning more about the ancient history of Hyrule, gathering new information that adds some context to the surface world. So when you return to Hyrule on the surface, it feels a little bit different even though it looks the same. It kind of feels like going back to your hometown for the first time after being away from it for 10 years. Yeah, it looks the same, but your wider knowledge of the outside world really changes it. And that's the big difference that I want to highlight here. This is kind of a game about science in all of its different forms. There's that archaeology aspect I talked about, but there's also researching and engineering and testing and experimenting, and that plays into some of its new gameplay hooks as well. Link's Breath of the Wild abilities in this game are gone and replaced with a set of new ones. For instance, he has Ascend, which lets him move through any ceiling, and he has Rewind, which lets him rewind an object's trajectory back into the past. Now, these are deceptively useful tools that get used in a lot of different ways, and you especially get to see that in some of this game's shrines, which are fantastic small puzzle challenges that are even better than the ones we saw in Breath of the Wild. I mean, some of them remind me of some of Portal's best test chambers, and what's really cool about them is that there isn't just one solution to them. It wants you to outsmart the developers and find your own solutions to puzzles, and it gives you a lot of different ways to do that. You're very much there to experiment and test out theories. And you also see that in Ultra Hand. Ultra Hand is the star of this game. It's an ability that lets Link pick up any object and glue it to another with ease. Now, this lets him make anything from weapons to vehicles that he can ride around Hyrule. He does that with the help of Zonai devices, which are ancient pieces of technology like fans and rockets that can help him move around, as well as weapons that he can strap to ships like fire beams and lasers. So much of the fun of this game comes from just creating things. From saying, hey, I have an idea, I want to try something, and putting it together. So maybe you want to make a car that has a flamethrower on the front, or maybe you want to make a hot air balloon that has a bunch of bombs tied to the bottom and see if you can drop them on enemies below. What happens in this game is that you come up with an idea, you put it together, and then you watch it work, or spectacularly fail, forcing you to go back to the drawing board and test your hypothesis again. Once again, we go back to this idea of this being a game about science. Everything you're doing goes back to that idea, whether you're searching for clues and learning about an ancient history, whether you're researching what certain objects do by testing them out with Fuse and Ultra Hand, or whether you're just building things and trying to become an engineering genius in Hyrule. That significantly changes what it's like to play this game, despite the fact that all the gameplay hooks are just about the same. Sure, you're still doing the same thing where you're going to shrines and finding Koroks. That stuff that's great in Breath of the Wild is still great here. But what's really special is how powerful this creative suite is and how much it makes you feel like a genius. You get to come up with ideas and say, okay, what happens if I do this? Let's find out. And then through trial and error and research and learning how the world works, you eventually get to pull those things off, and it's incredibly gratifying when it happens. Rather than telling you about how every individual system works, I instead want to give you an anecdote, because I think the power of this game comes in the stories that it allows you to tell. So listen to this. About 60 hours into the game, I thought that I was done with it. I thought I was going to the final battle, and that was that, ready to clear it. But something was nagging me. I had this main story quest that I hadn't resolved yet, and if I tried to go to the last fight, I knew that that would eat at me. But the thing is, I couldn't figure out how to get to it. It was locked behind this strange riddle. Now, what eventually would happen is that I would go somewhere I hadn't been to before and realize that I hadn't explored it thoroughly enough. I wasn't curious enough to look at a strange object in the town that would trigger this quest. And once I did, it set me on this whole fantastic quest line. I went up to the Sky Islands, I did this whole traversal puzzle, and I eventually ended in this ancient chamber in the sky. And when I got there, I realized I had been there before. And I realized that about 30 hours earlier in the game, I had a moment where I decided, you know, I want to build a weird flying machine that'll get me way, way across the sky to a place that I'm not even really supposed to be at yet. I did that and wound up in this chamber that I didn't realize was an incredibly important and crucial part to the story. And when I returned to it, I realized that there was a door there the entire time that if I had just gone and pressed, I would have unlocked this quest without actually triggering the inciting incident at all. So I wasn't lost, I hadn't missed anything, it's just that I was 3 steps ahead of the game by being a really thorough researcher. And those are the moments that make Tears of the Kingdom special and different from Breath of the Wild. It is a game that is constantly rewarding you for being curious. If you go out in the world and decide to make a weird device to get somewhere strange, you might end up way ahead of where you're supposed to be in the story, and it rewards that, and it lets that happen. You're never gated. This game wants you to break it and stretch its limits. It wants you to solve things well before the developers lead you to them. And that's so special. Video games these days don't really do that. They're always trying to hold you by the hand or move you towards things. A lot of open world games give you the freedom to go wherever you want to go, but they don't necessarily give you the freedom to tackle it in any order that you want, and that's what you get here. Your creativity guides the experience, and I'll be honest, I think that's going to make this game a little divisive for some people too. It puts a lot of demands on the player. It really wants you to be creative and break it, and if you don't, sometimes it's easy to get lost. It also has a really complicated control scheme that, I'll be honest, is a total nightmare, and after 70 hours of play, I still am not totally used to it. Despite some of those approachability issues, I think this is a totally spectacular sequel that really builds on top of Breath of the Wild while offering something completely new. And if you're looking for the right way to go into it like a researcher. Think like a scientist, like you're there in Hyrule to test hypotheses and find data to support that. And if you do that, if you interact with all of its systems and really try your hand at crafting and fusing together ideas and testing things and failing and succeeding, you're gonna have an experience that may be just as special as Breath of the Wild, even if it doesn't feel quite as fresh as that game did when it launched. I'm personally excited to see all of the wild hijinks that the community gets into, as well as all of the incredible inventions that I know are still to come in The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom. This feels like a game that we're going to be talking about 10 years from now, and we still won't have found its bottom by then.